Hi everyone, so we are in my flat today once again. Why is this? Because it's minus 17 degrees, or at least it was yesterday. I think it's a little bit warmer today, maybe minus 7. It's snowing everywhere. It's certainly not the kind of weather where I want to be wandering around with my camera making a little video out and about. But worry not, I will be interspersing, editing in some shots of the winter wonderland that is Warsaw currently into this video, so you still get to experience the joys of the fairly brutal winter that we've got at the moment. And I wanted to make a video today, even though this isn't going to be the most sort of coherent video I don't think that I've ever made. I do feel a kind of a need to be making these videos from a couple of perspectives. First of all, it does occur to me that I have got a bizarrely loyal little crowd of people in my channel, and I really appreciate you watching these videos. I appreciate the comments, the conversations that go on in the comments section below, and also some of you people have been generous enough to support me on my Buy Me a Coffee, and I do feel some degree of, I guess, loyalty that I owe you guys this space to have those conversations. And for those of you who have contributed so generously to my fund, I feel I need to keep providing you with some content, and I really appreciate that, and I hope that you enjoy these videos as I put them out. So I will continue from that perspective, but also I do still agree with what I said months ago when I was talking about the value of trans creators in general. And even though I'm only getting a couple of hundred views these days, that's still 200 views more than that would exist without my videos, if that makes sense. You know, I still see, even though that contribution is tiny to the wider narrative, I think it's important that there are people like me out there, fairly boring trans people in my view, just saying stuff, because I think sometimes that boring nature of our lives can be underrepresented and undertold, and I want to be telling the boring trans story in that sense. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm kind of going against that. I don't want to say that being trans is strange in a bad way. I think that strangeness, oddness, difference is a necessary and important feature of the universe. I think that trans people's existence creates an interesting little friction between people and their gender identity. We necessarily demand conversation about these things. And I think that on a wider sense, even for cis people, having these kinds of conversations and even internal or external dialogue or conversations, it helps them better understand their own kind of sense of gender, where they fit into the world. And I think it's really beautiful that trans people can kind of create that conversation. Even if a lot of people would rather that not take place, it is, and it has to. Not only because we exist, but because people exist at large. And I think we really do need to be thinking kind of deeper and philosophically about who we are and what we represent as individuals. And I think it's great that we carry that conversation forwards, even though that does come with sort of challenges and risks and problems. But hey ho, you know, that's part of the process of the understanding of human existence, I guess. And also, I think if everybody had the same kind of relationship with themselves, if everybody was cis, it would make the world a much less interesting place. I mean, come on. I think the very nature of transness does create a added dimension of color and beauty to humanity. Anyway, so I wanted to talk a bit about the weirdness of being trans, and I'm gonna use words like weird and crazy and bizarre, and I don't want people to kind of take this out of context, make it seem that I'm kind of being derogatory towards certain people. That's not the case. I'm just struggling for other words to describe this kind of circumstance. So I apologize ahead of time if you find use of these words in a sort of free and kind of tongue-in-cheek way. If you feel that that's inappropriate, I apologize up front. I acknowledge that maybe I'm not using it particularly well, but I don't have any other vocabulary to use in this case, so that's what I'm going to use. Okay? So, yes, being trans is strange, it's crazy, it's wild. What can I say? And I think, first of all, I have to say it's crazy in my own sort of sense of self. I grew up for 40 years expecting my life to turn out in a certain way, even though I'd always had this kind of trans identity, even that could have been subconscious or unaware of this back when I was a child and a teenager, to having a bit more of an understanding and awareness of this in my 20s and 30s before I was fully aware that I was trans in my late 20s. I think that's fair to say. I expected my life to turn out in a fairly standard way. You know, for instance, as I aged, I could expect certain changes to my body, that of a middle-aged man, let's say. So you can imagine the kind of changes that those would create. And as unacceptable as that seemed, I didn't really see much of a choice, because that's what I was born as, that's what I was assigned as birth, and that's the life you're kind of given. I mean, I'd already been through puberty as a male and had to suffer that. And I survived, so I could survive the next round of physical changes, right? But as time went by, that seemed less and less acceptable. And it occurred to me one day that transitioning was actually something that was available to me, that I could do this. And that idea alone was just almost so alien to me, because I hadn't ever considered that this was an option. I'd always thought transitioning was for somebody else. I'm not the sort of person that transitions, because, I mean, I always saw myself as fairly dull and standard and boring and not especially interesting or exciting. And transitioning is for people who are interesting, who are brave, who have certain confidence about themselves. None of those things I would say I had about myself. So the fact that I'm doing this, it represents something really strange and unusual for myself. Because I never saw myself as the sort of person that would transition, even though, you know, if you look at the stories of trans people going through transitioning on Reddit and other places, there's a whole range and variety of people that make those steps. It's often out of a sort of a necessity more than a choice. And so because of that, people from all sort of walks of life, different ages, different backgrounds, different philosophies, different perspectives of the world, they find themselves in a place where they need to start transitioning. So that kind of idea that there's a specific and particular type of person that does this, and I'm not that person, that's kind of like a me problem, I suppose. And the fact that I'm now doing this suggests that, yeah, anybody could do this so long as your circumstances allow you to. And so that kind of bolt from the blue, that I can do this, was the first kind of sense of weirdness, because it just had never occurred to me that this was a thing. And then as I started, just as I was getting into the transitioning, world, you know, going for appointments with therapists, with psychologists, with the endocrinologists, that kind of made the process seem a lot more accessible and real. But the changes that I have seen in the last 2 years, pretty much, I can't explain how strange that is for me. I mean, as I said, I'd always expected my life to have a certain kind of rhythm to it, that I would start here and end there, much like everybody else that has gone before me has, in terms of, you know, cis presenting male. And so to go from the assumption that I would age as a middle-aged man to now aging as a middle-aged trans woman is such a mind shift, and seeing those changes happen in slow motion but in real time as well. It's just wild for me watching my body develop in certain ways that I would never have thought were possible. Even just as I was taking my first doses of medication, I did not expect to see the changes that I have. I was expecting minimal changes. And in fairness, they haven't exactly been like astronomical, and a lot of the changes have been ones that I've kind of done, like laser or getting haircuts or something like this, that are kind of independent of hormones. But even so, those changes, as wild as they are starting to become normal. I mean, the physical bodily changes I love, but the fact that now certain things feel like they're just as much a part of my body as the hands and the end of my arms or my nose or something like this, it's just amazing for me. And sometimes I have these kind of almost out of body metacognitive kind of realizations that just how far I've come, like physically and psychologically, and how just remarkable that is, but also how strange that is. If you kind of take a step back and think about what you're doing to yourself, you're taking medication to somewhat artificially change the way that your body constructs itself. And obviously, you can only do so much with that. I mean, my voice, my Adam's apple, my nose, my height, my hands, my feet, certain other areas, they're going to remain fairly constant. So those changes can only be so drastic. But even so, I'm looking to change the way fat distributes in my body, the relative strength that I have in my arms and legs and elsewhere, the way that I carry myself in the world. It's really strange. I said many times, I love history and I read about human experiences through the years. And it's like, this is the first time in history where this has been widely available. I'm not talking about necessarily being in a culture where trans people are a feature. I mean, you can find sort of third gender sort of stories in other cultures, like in Asia and in Native American cultures. But specifically, I'm talking about this very Western kind of idea of being trans and taking hormones. And within that very bi-gendered setup that we have here, switching from one side to the other. And it does make me think sometimes when I think about like this kind of cultural history of transness, maybe sometimes a third gender wouldn't necessarily be a bad way of seeing things, because I do recognize our experience falls outside of the cis kind of norms for both men and women. So whether you're a trans woman or a trans man, the way that you have arrived at that gender is very different to the way that cis people understand and recognize and arrive at theirs. And I think that this is one reason why I'm quite happy and proud to have trans as one of my adjectives, one of the many things that would describe me, because I think it is important and valid to recognize that journey that I've made from here to there. It's been long and it's been hard, and I think it's definitely worthwhile just kind of having a little notation of that to show that where I'm coming from is quite specific. And I know that that carries a certain degree of baggage, and I know that not everybody wants that to kind of go ahead of them. I certainly would prefer people to not be using the kind of the narrative of trans stuff before they meet me, or upon meeting me even. But I do think that it's certainly valid in acknowledging that my experience is different to that of a cis woman. And I don't mind that, because it's true. Cis women have had to struggle with the things they've had to struggle with. And cis and trans women have to struggle a lot of the time. There's a lot of parallels and overlaps there, but some of those challenges are different to that of cis women. But in the same way, the struggles of black women have some parallels and some differences with the struggles of white women. And I think by removing that trans element of my identity, you're kind of erasing a lot of that struggle and a lot of that self-actualization that I've been through in order to get to this point. So I will always be proud, I think, to be a trans woman. And I know that carries a certain risk factor. But I came into this with my eyes fully open. So yeah, I guess case sera in that case. So what else is weird about the trans experience? Well, I think the other thing that I find quite weird, but this is probably in a less satisfying way, is like suddenly you're forced at some point when if you start transitioning, you suddenly need to be relearning so many things that a lot of people take quite for granted. And I think sometimes it's overlooked that when you're cis and you go through, say, puberty, you're going through a very, very disruptive, life-changing experience, but you're doing that oftentimes surrounded by a lot of other peers in a space where it's understood that you're doing that, and you have this freedom almost to play around with what your future identity might mean. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that once you reached your 20s or whenever puberty has ended for you, that stops. I think people are often kind of experimenting and trying out new ways and styles and whatever, but oftentimes it's done in a much more, let's say, mature and safe kind of space. With teenagers, often you see people taking a lot of risks and really putting themselves out there and doing some crazy off-the-wall stuff in the name of finding themselves and discovering who they really are. And when you're trans, you're going through a kind of puberty, but it could be at some very different time in your life. It could be in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 70s even in some cases. And you're often doing this without that same level of peer group support as you would be in your teens or in your adolescence periods. It's certainly much less acceptable for you to be indulging in that same kind of, I guess, childish self-discovery that, teenage cis people do. So it does mean that we're often in this kind of conflicting space where we're having to kind of experiment and learn what it means to be within our genders. I mean, just as an example, you might notice I've got a haircut, and so I'm trying to be a little bit more intentional with how I style my hair because, oh my god, I looked amazing as I was coming out of that hair salon, and I want to capture the lightning in that bottle every day. But today was the first day I tried to style my hair without the guidance and basically without Carolina doing it for me. And it was an absolute disaster. I kind of knew what I needed to do, but I just didn't have the coordination between my hands to kind of like use the brush appropriately and then get the nozzle to dry on the strands of hair that I was trying to style, and it was just going everywhere. And oh my goodness, it was so frustrating. And this is the sort of thing that cis girls and women often learn to do in their teens, where they can get away with having hair all over the place because it's kind of understood that some days that's going to happen. Similarly with makeup, it's like I'm trying to experiment relatively slowly. I'm trying to ease things in one thing at a time because it means that I can kind of get a handle how to use these things. Like now I'm in my lipstick era, let's put it that way. And I love playing. I love playing around with these things and experimenting with how makeup can change how things are accentuated on my face. But I do realize that I can only push that boundary so far because as a 45-year-old woman, there are certain expectations, there are certain things that I just can't get away with at this age. And that's a real shame because I would love to experiment and do some really off-the-wall stuff, but I just feel that I just can't do that because there's a certain expectation for how middle-aged people at large are supposed to act. And it's not that. And so when I see trans people at large feeling free enough to express themselves in that way, I just feel so joyful for them. And I know that there is a school of thought where, you can look at those sorts of people and sort of turn your nose up to a certain extent because they're giving us a bad name. Look at them going out there like this could be the only trans person that like the wider public see, and oh my god, look at them, they're such a disaster. But I mean, in my view, fair play to them. Like, let them go and play with dolls and wear like super femme or super masculine type outfits. Even though it's not necessarily good for their bodies, it doesn't, necessarily work with their body shape or whatever. We need that space. We need to be able to play around and experiment and see what works and what doesn't. Maybe that's just my own conservatism coming through, because I do know I dress fairly conservatively, and maybe a lot of what I'm talking about is my own kind of hang-ups and my own paranoias and my own kind of, I guess, neuroses coming through, and I don't know. What can I say? Anyway, where was I? So yes, being trans is weird on a kind of individual kind of journey sense. It's very weird in terms of a kind of how do you even start to navigate that sort of space. And it's also really weird in terms of just being out there in the world kind of space. I mean, I will go around and I am often the only trans person I see, at least, in the world. And as much as I don't mind that, I know that I'm fairly visibly trans and I've made peace with that, and that's fine. I get the looks, I get the stares, that's fine. It is what it is. It would be nice to not always be the trans person in the room. It would be nice to not be the first trans person in XYZ. I'm not the first trans person that some people have met. I'm not the first trans person in this organization. I'm not the first trans person in this office or whatever. I didn't necessarily sign up to be a pioneer, but it's often how I feel sometimes. It seems that my experience may well be the ground that other trans people then have to walk on, and that carries a hell of a lot of pressure. It really does. I'm very conscious that in a lot of cases, I'm setting the standard. I'm creating, maybe almost, not necessarily consciously or overtly, I'm creating people's internal or organizations' explicit policies and the way that they feel they should be treating trans people. And that's hard because I can only go with what I feel is important for me, and the next trans person that comes along, they will probably have very different kind of points of view and perspectives. And it really does worry me that the things that I say and do will colour the perceptions of that next trans person when they come along. You know what I mean? It means that I hope that what I'm doing is leaving this space in a better and safer place for the next person, but I don't know if I am. Because I know that sometimes I need to be somewhat outspoken in terms of asserting my rights, and by extension those of other trans people. I need to be, because I can be a bit of a mouthpiece in my organization, for instance, because I have a certain degree of influence there. And it's hard because I don't know if I'm using that adequately. I don't know if I'm using that effectively. I don't know if I'm using that appropriately. I'm going off of instinct. So it's a real worry for me. It's something that I do and have always been conscious of, that I'm an example. And that was something that I never had to worry about as a cis presenting person. If I did something good or bad or whatever, mediocre, there were never people going to then say, well, I met a cis man and they did a good or bad or mediocre thing. But in a lot of cases, I'm going to be the trans woman that sets an example for others. And I know that I've seen other people talk about this, other trans people talk about this in forums, and I know a lot of folk do kind of reject that idea that it's for them to be educating the wider kind of world. And I get that. I think that education is a calling and you shouldn't be pressured into kind of being the teacher. But ultimately, we are, whether we like it or not, we are. If you're as visibly trans as I am, you're going to stand out. And I feel that carries a certain burden and responsibility, and I don't know if I'm succeeding. It's really hard. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for all of you for persevering with this channel and watching this video. Thank you so much, of course, to those of you who have and continue to support me on my Buy Me a Coffee. It really does mean the world to me, and in my current circumstance, it makes the difference from having to just kind of get by and survive to actually being able to, well, literally buy myself a coffee, which is what I'm going to do this afternoon. And in these days, we all need those little kind of luxuries and something that we can do for ourselves just to make the world feel a slightly more bearable place. I'd love to say that's going to be a segue into some kind of ad for, I don't know, what's around me, Legos or something. Yeah, buy Lego because it makes the world a better place or something, but no. Maybe the sponsors are waiting. Anyway, so have yourselves a wonderful week, a wonderful day. I hope you're staying warm. I hope that you are safe, and I hope that you are well. All the best, and I'll see you all very soon. Take care. Goodbye.